All right. Thank you, everyone, for being here. My name is Judy Scott Clayton. I am a professor of economics and education at Teachers College, Columbia University, and I will be moderating this panel on expanding access to education, which we had some prep calls before this conference, but I think after the last keynote, I was taking some notes. I think we're just going to jump right off of that conversation and keep it going. So before we get into that, let me briefly introduce the rest of our panel. Their full bios are in your little booklet if you'd like to read more details. To my left, I have Dr. Kira Bo-Jackson, who is a professor of human development and social policy and a labor economist here at Northwestern University. To his left, we have Barbara Schneider, the John A. Hanna University Distinguished Professor of Education and Sociology at Michigan State University. And finally, at the end there, we have Neil Finkelstein, a senior research scientist and director of the Innovation Studies program at WestEd. So in my role at Teachers College, I'm also affiliated with the Community College Research Center. And so I couldn't help but think, as we were listening to the last presentation, about community colleges and along the aspects of access to education that Dr. Agarwal was speaking of. Community colleges seem to be doing pretty well on a lot of those metrics. Open admissions, quote-unquote stackable credentials, short-term certificates, online courses. They're low cost, so I just looked up online a 3-credit course at Community College of Chicago would be about $400, so not that much more than potentially an online course. So have we already solved this problem? I mean, are community colleges just not getting the credit that they deserve? Certainly even within the community college context, there's concern that they're not doing enough. People are worried about completion rates in particular. So how do we jump into this conversation? Is access even a problem anymore, or should we just move on to talking about other problems?
I guess I can start, Judy. One of the things that we can talk about is sort of the access question in the community college sector for so many years. And, I like the way that you've connected Dr. Agarwal's innovations and the optimism of where we're headed in the next generation to the sort of reflection of are we there yet in some ways with some of the programming going on. I think the transition from our secondary education systems into the community college system in the United States, it is certainly one of the things that's gotten an awful lot of bright light in the last 20 years. It wouldn't be unfair to say that you could seriously document anywhere between 60 and 80% of students entering the community college system in American state systems needing to be remediated in math or in language or in both. And of those who succeed through those remedial sequences, it would be fair to say that about 2 in 5 ultimately succeeded in getting a full associate's degree at the end of an extended period of time. These are these patterns that have just been so hard to shake and shift. And I think for those of us who have worked on this transition between secondary and post-secondary ed into the community college system, we've all been searching for these pathways of not only the credentialing and the flexibility, but ways to see the students sort of where they are. They're older, they've struggled more in school, they're more mobile, they're balancing work and family responsibilities in real time. The indebtedness structure of sort of where do you find the time and the trade-offs of work are very, very significant. Not the least of which is they're coming into this community college experience in many regards just not sufficiently prepared in foundational skills. Having said all that, I think it is actually a quite optimistic time, and I think you can find systems across the country that have done many of these kinds of innovations, both on the structure and design of course pathways, the way that the badging work is taking hold, and a certain recognition that the pathway structures need to be well supported, not only with guidance and counseling and peer structures, but also with a recognition and a set of expectations that students will move forward and make it through with their badges and credentials intact. So I'm pretty optimistic, and yet there are still many, many systemic challenges ahead.
Thank you.
Well, I think that there are probably more challenges that we need to think about when we're addressing reforms that need to take place. So the condition of education just recently this week released its latest statistics on the numbers of students that are going to community colleges, numbers of students that are going to four-year colleges, and what populations they represent. So it is certainly the case that the majority of young people that are moving directly into the community college system right after high school tend to be low income and minority. So when you think about this, we're basically running a two-tier system when it comes to issues related to socioeconomic status and race and ethnicity. In addition to that, the time to degree for the two-year student is much higher than the time for degree than the four-year student. Not only that, but the proportion of money that is being spent to keep yourself in a two-year college, that proportion is higher than what it would necessarily mean if you were in a four-year institution. So I feel that for us, we have to really think very hard, not to say that community colleges are not trying very hard. Many of them have moved into different kinds of programs so that this issue of remediation doesn't stop everybody and doesn't keep them there for 8 years and running up huge amounts of debt. But on the other hand, we have to realize that young people moving into community colleges still think that they're going to transfer to a four-year college. I'm talking now about students leaving right after high school. They think that it's all, ambition is in front of their eyes. And as soon as they take that Hope Scholarship or whatever kind of scholarship they're being asked or given, pretty soon it's coming out of your pocket on how much you owe MasterCard or Visa or anybody else, because it isn't enough. It's just not enough to cover the costs of any kind of education that you want to pursue if you are low income and minority and on this particular track.
Sure, and I'll just sort of say, so most of my research is focused on the pre-K to K-12 space. And even though it may be true that individuals may have greater access, and it's certainly true, which is a good thing, that individuals now have greater access to community colleges and four-year colleges. It's also true that the quality of the college one can basically attend is a function of what a student looks like before they get there. So more prepared students are more likely to get into schools that tend to have larger positive impacts on their outcomes later on in life. So in order to have sort of equal access, I think it needs to be the case that individuals are given equal opportunity to be sort of similarly prepared when they actually end up at the point where they're going to be applying to colleges. And we sort of know, based on research, that the outcomes of a child, by the time they get to the age of 18, are somewhat determined by the quality of the schools that they basically have access to prior, several years prior. And unfortunately, when children are under the age of 18, they typically live at home, which means that geography is going to play a large role in the quality of schools to which children have access to early on. And when you have things like segregation or by income or also by ethnicity, you tend to have sort of pockets of geographical locations where the quality of schools that are basically accessible to students may be quite different from those that are accessible to other children. So I think it's great that we have greater access to community colleges, but I think in order to have access be truly equal, we need to have broader access much earlier on.
Great. So this is bringing up a lot of sort of themes that I'm hoping we'll return to throughout this throughout the panel. And one is the distinction or sometimes the tension between ensuring access to something versus providing equal access to a full range of educational options. And the other thing that I'd like to turn us to now is in thinking about access, a lot of the conversation tends to be about cost as a barrier. But we can see, even in situations where there's a low-cost option, that doesn't necessarily remove all the barriers. So in thinking about, and this, we could think about it either in the K-12 context or in the higher education context, and thinking about the things that help promote student success, what are the other barriers besides cost? And I can speak to that too, but I would like to get your thoughts on that. So maybe thinking about the high school to college transition, for example.
Okay, are you pointing to me?
No, I'm not. I'm really throwing it to whoever would like to jump in.
Well, I think that I also study preparation and the transition into college. So the first thing that really makes a huge difference in the preparation, especially when you look at young people that are in 10th and 12th grade, is the kind of courses that they take. And if you look at schools that are predominantly low income and minority, you find out the civil rights put out a great report. 80% of them don't even have advanced level courses that are the courses that are needed for access into post-secondary education. So if you take something as simple as what's the trajectory in terms of the kinds of courses that you need to be able to access higher education, whether it's in a 2-year or 4-year institution, that's a number one, that's a really hard challenge. The second one that really makes it difficult is that the informational context. If you look at a middle class high school, the kinds of information that the peer group gives, the teachers give, the community gives about what the college landscape looks like is so much deeper and richer than what you find in communities that have sustained poverty over time. This makes it very difficult to even understand what your options are, what the situation might be for you, given the kinds of interests you have, and where you could possibly likely go. And the third thing that really matters is that your interest and those things that you're passionate about are never fully articulated. They're not mentors and people in the institutions that you're in that can kind of look at you and understand you have ambitions. You have things you want to do in your life. We don't draw those things out very often for young people that have limited social and economic resources. And I think of all the things that we are doing right now is that we give false hope. And instead of really trying to understand where young people want to go and could go, and giving them an opportunity to articulate that, unfortunately, we shut that down as well.
Let me build on it, Barbara. I think this kind of coupling that we can make just from your points on, to pick one on course design, it adds to your comment about sort of those sequencing matters, and certainly builds on Bo's comment about the long kind of longitudinal trajectory of these patterns. You can do these representations in any which way, but I've been struck by putting anything that has a longitudinal pattern into a Sankey diagram. Many of you have seen these, and it's just such a simple way of seeing the profound patterns of sort of predictable flow between the stratifications of students in our population. If you're not doing very well in high school and you're following a medical pathway through the community college system and there are fits and starts, the likelihood of ending up in a $17 an hour a medical assistant role for family health care is actually pretty likely. If you're more skilled and you have more advanced degrees, obviously your labor potential in job opportunities is so significantly different. The reason I say that these patterns are so stable and these diagrams show these consistencies is we track it back, and I guess that's the point that I want to really emphasize here. I'm as able to predict some of these outcomes in those early years of post-secondary from 8th grade course patterns in math as I am anywhere along these trajectories. And so we find ourselves constantly looking backwards. What is it about this really, really complicated 8th grade barrier to learning about algebra? What does it signal about foundations in proportional thinking and the kinds of opportunities that it raises? And so I only want to reinforce that the patterns that we see in high school as they lead lead to community college. A third of students in the state of California don't take math as a senior in their high school year. It's a profound number. Are all indications of a system that is still working so hard on the preparation of students at younger ages. So we have a transition problem, and we can link it backwards, and I think the journey is on improving those pathways all along, and really, in my judgment, not losing track of those early intervention strategies.
And to sort of push that even farther back, there's some work that I've been doing looking at what happens to a child if you live in a neighborhood that happens to get an increase in money to spend on public schools. And the finding there is that you can take basically two kids from the same neighborhood who basically were born 4 or 5 years apart, and the kid who was in school when the school got more money had way better outcomes than the child who was at those schools who graduated before the money was sort of hit the district. We find that those kids were more likely to graduate high school, more likely to go to college and earn more money. They're also less likely to be involved in the criminal justice system later on. And then what was sort of really exciting is it turns out you can even see the same thing if you go even further back and look at pre-K. So if you look at individuals who had access based purely on geography to Head Start, basically started in 1965. If you look at cohorts who were in different neighborhoods when Head Start was available versus not available, those that were in those geographic locations right after it was available compared to those in the same locations before, or I should say before it was available, had way better outcomes than basically due to having access to some kind of pre-K. We actually layered those two things together, and basically having access to pre-K plus having access to a better resourced K through 12 education led to increased educational attainment, higher earnings, reduced criminality, and just a much lower likelihood of being poor as an adult. Mm-hmm. So these things start very, very early, and I know there are people in this room who would tell me, you need to go even further back. Probably when you in sort of the gestational age, there's some inequalities there too, but it can go pretty far back.
Okay, so I want to come back to this issue of, I'm going to come back to the question of, is it too late by the time we get to college? And I'm going to push back on that a little. But before we get to that, I want to jump on another point, which is just this question of resources, and do resources matter? Sort of part of the hope and the promise and the excitement about a lot of the innovation that's going on is the idea that we could get around this conundrum and be able to provide greater access to greater quality educational opportunity without having to make additional, massive financial resource commitments. Is that possible? And is it more possible in higher ed than it is maybe in pre-K or K-12? Why is it that your research shows that resources do matter, certainly in the K-12 context? Why? Why do resources still matter, and is there some way to get around that? And is it easier to do that at the higher education level, do we think?
Well, I can tell you at the K-12 situation, resources matter enormously. I just have one example. We have a brand new science curriculum that we're developing and testing. And if you look at the numbers of high schools in LA and Detroit that don't have sinks, that don't have hoods, you can't even do any of the experiments that people think are really basic for chemistry, for physics. There are none of those materials. This is the United States. And we do not have the kinds of equipment that young people need to be able to move ahead. That's true with access to computers. There are computer labs, and then there's no bandwidth. And then they get locked into a closet and they're not repaired. It is really a very difficult situation. I think in terms of what is happening, the best papers I've seen on this right now come from a young woman that's now at Brown, Emily Roschauer, and she has done, I think, some of the best work to show how much money matters. And I think, Mr. Hedges, you told us a while ago that money mattered, and I think that was a very important piece. And I think that it's still the case today that money, resources do matter K-12. I also think that they matter a lot for higher ed, but I'll let my colleagues speak first, and then I'll go next.
Okay.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to make a comment on sort of the resourcing of higher education systems. It's such a broad and vast topic, and it goes from privates to publics to for-profits and everywhere in between, with so much that we could talk about. I think, going back and leaning on Barbara's point for a minute, it's the indebtedness that our students face, which is sort of where the rubber hits the road. And you can look at the enormous examples of stories of the challenges that students face with, $20, $30, $50, $100,000 in debt coming out, and the work that's been done recently on challenging this assumption that the return on investment for these students and families is being found later on in their lives based on their trajectories. But it's a very complicated thing to untangle. I would only say that there are ever more examples of ways in which the systems are operating more efficiently. Certainly true in the public systems, which I spend more time on. Just an incredible systemic emphasis on normative time and reductions in the time to completion. Graduation initiatives that are system-wide, that are really looking for what is the support that it takes in order to be able to move students through in 4 years and not 5 years, or in 5 years and not 6 years, given the other constraints they're facing. But I would have to just comment that American higher education is one of the most profoundly wealthy sets of institutions in the world, and this idea that we have put high price tags on these and made them unaffordable for many students is indeed a comment on a bold limit to access. So I think there's important pressure to put on all of us to continue to study that and work on those issues.
Great. So one way that some institutions are trying to be more efficient and cut costs is by looking potentially to online courses as a way to continue to provide access, perhaps without the same sort of capital classroom space constraints and perhaps with reduced instructor costs. But these new models can play out differently depending on whether we're talking about graduate students doing MBAs, for example, at Georgia Tech, where there's some very strong research indicating that really does improve access, and students going through those programs have positive outcomes. Again, returning to the community college context, the evidence on online courses has been discouraging, in part because of the high rates of dropout throughout the courses. Which brings me to another barrier I want to talk about, which again has struck me in the community college context, where there's sort of increasing recognition that one of the barriers that students face when they get to a community college is just sort of being overwhelmed with the number of options that they do have and not knowing how to navigate their way through those options. And so I'm wondering if any of you would like to comment on strategies or interventions, and potentially even using technology to help students navigate their way through educational systems, to get through those informational or advising barriers that may layer on top of preparation and financial barriers.
I mean, one program that I'm aware of, I think is based right around here in Chicago, like 1 Million Degrees, for example, so this gets to the question of resources, so obviously someone has to pay for it, but it's basically a program that identifies children or kids who are going to college, community college specifically, and basically provides some amount of essentially just mentorship and guidance about not just navigating the higher educational landscape, but also just what life is like being a student and navigating that transition from being someone in high school to someone in college. And my sense is that the evidence on this seems to be very, very positive. The students are much more likely to sort of stay in, much less likely to attrit from college. And I think the likelihood of them transferring from the 2-year to the 4-year is much higher. And my sense is it's not a tremendously expensive program, but that sort of, I guess, human element is really important. And even just having someone physically available to talk to as one is going through the various, hurdles that one goes through as one transitions is really important. So it's not just that you go through and talk to someone on day one for orientation, but having someone that you can just send an email to and chat with on a regular basis to talk through some of these issues, and maybe even provide referrals for people who may have other social issues involved. People like single mothers may need to have access to services. People may have mental health situations. They need to talk to someone to get counseling. So these kinds of someone who's able to sort of provide them with the wraparound services is really, really important. I think that could be very, very cost effective.
Yeah, just building on Bo's comment, you may all be familiar with the College Promise Initiative. It's one example, and I think the reason I just sort of raise it is that it connects us a little bit to the chase for evidence that we talked about yesterday. This idea of College Promise were federal dollars that were distributed during the Obama administration and made available for kind of local consortia at the regional level to put together support opportunities around the local employment, local labor market structures, the community college in the area, and feeder patterns that would allow for some opportunities in structured ways. But it's the combination of things, and that's why I raise it, of sort of that weaving together or braiding together what component of the promise of employment was responsible for the success of these students, what component had to do with the coaching that was provided. There were colleges that opened up financial aid offices on weekends and evenings because it turned out that that was actually more helpful to people than them being open from 9 to 4 on weekdays. There were nudges that were provided through text messaging services that announced counseling opportunities for students as opposed to single appointments. There were opportunities for putting together group counseling and peer structures that gave students a set of awareness. There are modifications around parking on campuses. It's really interesting to sort of see in these sort of programmatic designs these small little pieces that come together to build and thread systems that are all intended, I think, really, quite frankly, to experiment with the ability of these students the ability of the programs to support students in these really systemic ways, which is, I think, the point that Bo makes right. Yeah.
And I think that MDRC pulling back, to this concept of evidence has really, started to do some of the most experimental work on the community college. But your center at Teachers College has done amazing things with the CUNY system and other systems as well. Maybe you could even tell us a little bit more about that.
Sure. I mean, I think in the community college context, one of the big pushes, which is, again, it sort of strikes me as being sort of almost in some ways in the opposite direction of the conversation about making things more modular, making things more individualized, making things more reliant on technology. At a lot of community colleges, the concern is actually that they want to provide their students more structured pathways through community college. But one place where we do see the technological innovation is in the advising and some of the other services, not just thinking about technological innovation inside the classroom, but outside the classroom, and looking for these low-cost opportunities to simplify financial aid applications, simplify the advisor-student communications, text message interventions, all these nudge-type interventions to make sure students are aware of where they can go for additional help. There are just a lot of informational challenges if you think about a student transitioning from the high school context where things are more structured to the college context where suddenly it's this open expanse of seemingly limitless opportunities, but not necessarily always a clear pathway through. And so there are examples of programs, and one that's been evaluated by MDRC, a very well-known program at CUNY, the ASAP program, which is a comprehensive program. It doesn't deal with just financial barriers. It also has more intensive advising. It has block scheduled courses, and that was able to double graduation rates, really make a big noticeable impact on aggregate graduation rates. And that's an example where they've been able to replicate that model successfully in a community college in Ohio. So that's an example of one promising strategy for community colleges. I wanted to come back to the question of preparation, though, because everybody, I think all of the panelists are talking about the importance of preparation. and the importance of early intervention, and I don't want to discount that at all. Clearly, that's very important. At the same time, it also, whatever sector, whatever level you're involved in education, we always see a tendency to want to be like looking back and saying, really, if we just had more prepared students, or even employers looking back and saying, if only, the colleges were doing a better job, we would have more prepared employees. So, there are opportunities. The evidence suggests there are opportunities at every transition point to improve things. And in particular, some of my research in community colleges on remediation. And this is just a small comment, thinking back to yesterday on the role of evidence in policy. One of the most influential papers that I was involved with was not a causal inference paper, was not a causal methods paper. It was basically a predictive validity study, just showing nobody had looked at these placement exams that most community colleges were using to determine whether a student was prepared or not to take college-level coursework. All these schools are using these exams, and students are taking them, and they're getting slotted into courses as a result. And when we took a really close look at the relationship between those exams and students' expected outcomes, there really was a very, very weak correlation, to the point that basically a large proportion of students who are being assigned to remediation, who are being classified as not ready for college, actually were predicted to do very well had they gone straight into college level. And that study, again, it wasn't a causal study, it was a sort of a descriptive, predictive analysis. And as a result, many colleges started reconsidering the use of these exams. And since then, there actually have been some experiments looking at interventions that just provide those supports along the way. So a sort of co-requisite model of remediation support, as opposed to requiring students to prepare, you're not prepared enough, you need to do X, Y, and Z before you can move ahead. And those sort of more accelerated models seem to be showing promise. So that's just a little pushback on this question of preparation, defining how prepared is prepared enough, and is it possible that we might actually be setting too many barriers in place, that even an open admissions community college might be putting too many barriers in place.
Well, I just want to go back to the comment that I made at the very beginning from the Office of Civil Rights, which basically says that the courses aren't even offered in the high school. Mm-hmm. And when we look at low-income and minority kids who take advanced courses, they do much better than the kids that didn't take the advanced courses. They may not do as well as everybody that's been through the system, but they certainly do a lot better than the kids that didn't have the opportunity. And I think that what we're seeing is that the gatekeeping mechanisms that operate within high school and in middle school make it very difficult for different populations to succeed and move ahead. And I think we have to look at those much more carefully and understand how they really are truly gatekeeping. Because if you took the student who took the advanced level, math course, got through Algebra 2 without taking it 3 times and having to take it for credit recovery over the summer, and then still never getting it right, you would see that they're the ones that are doing well on these tests that they have to take when they enter community college. So I think that the kind of work and evidence that we need to understand this process, we have to get what Neil, I think, really talked about, these predictive models for different subgroups, controlling on the kinds of high schools that you went to, so that these models that are currently in place with the kinds of experiments, we could start to estimate a little bit more carefully how we could think about what they needed before they took the test, so that basically we wouldn't have these wide variations if we had a better understanding, like if we interceded in a much earlier stage. like you've said.
So I mean, also just sort of add to that, I think, I mean, also to respond to your point, I think there's questions of preparation, which absolutely do matter, but there's also questions of whether, given someone's level of preparedness, they're actually performing up to their potential. And I think there's a lot of evidence that I've seen that just providing, for example, just information to someone about the importance of an exam for getting into college. Like some individuals may not even realize that taking this SAT thing may matter, and it has a large impact on the likelihood of going to college. Providing that information can increase someone's effort and actually make them perform better. But if you didn't, without the information, you just look at them, you see their test scores, see, oh, well, they're not up to the task. But in fact, there was sort of some informational problem there that was leading to them underperforming. And also, same thing about understanding that if you work hard, you can go to college. A lot of kids, I think, don't necessarily come from neighborhoods in like remote rural areas, inner city areas. There may be an environment where many of the adults around them, other than their teachers, didn't go to college. So they're not even thinking about how to navigate that whole system or know what to do. So what we see when we look at someone's achievement over time is a reflection of their skill and also their effort. And if their effort is a function or is determined by what they can aspire to do, if you don't provide them with models of where they could reach and what they can aspire to, they may not put in the effort and they may not appear to be as able as they are. So I think they definitely do matter. I've seen scenarios. So for example, talking about this access issue, one of the first paper I ever wrote was looking at a program in Texas where they basically provided open access to advanced placement courses, and they basically started paying students and teachers for passing scores on these exams. And it was targeted to schools that had very high shares of low-income and ethnic minority students. And what I found there was that students were much more likely to take these AP courses. They're more likely to go to college. They graduated college at higher rates, and they actually earned more money later on. And these were populations that tended to have low levels of college going previously. So this is a scenario where I'm sure they acquired some skills to the AP program, but I think having open access and providing them sort of incentives and encouragement to take these AP courses had a big impact on their likelihood of doing so. So I think that I think was a clear illustration of the fact that it was not too late. But certainly, when you think about the students that have benefited from that, it wasn't the students who are at the very bottom of the achievement distribution coming in. It was sort of the moderately well-prepared students who were able to benefit from that. So I think there's certainly a lot we can do in the later stages to help students who are on the margins of getting across these hurdles. But we still also have to make sure those that are at the bottom can get to be in that sort of bubble range where these marginal impacts can be realized.
Let me just build on it a little bit, Bo. I think the example that you provide is absolutely right. The point that I want to emphasize is just how profound some of these preparation challenges are. I am in school sites all the time, and I'm on college campuses watching the remedial courses, as Judy said, be less in vogue with more complicated multiple measure systems and more of a tendency to place what we believe is more accurately. And at the same time, you step into a college campus at 8 o'clock on a Wednesday morning in July, and it's 100 degrees outside. And the students who are 17 and 18 who have graduated from high school are struggling with a math professor around 7th and 8th grade standards. So just to put some real sort of concreteness to it, it's can you plot XY coordinates on a Cartesian graph? Can you solve a linear equation? Can you simplify a complex fraction? Do you have basic sort of representation of exponents? Can you convert fractions to decimals? The kinds of things that are being worked on in order to sort of quickly support students so that they become more and better prepared to take on the college work is sort of profound, and it really sort of just does become very, very humbling to not only watch the commitment of the students, knowing that this hasn't worked in early grades and knowing that these have become the barriers to moving forward, at the same time that they're being provided this environment which is actually helping to accelerate them through sort of on a second chance. I also would point out that these become these gatekeeper issues that we're all concerned about. So if you're one of the students in the room on that Wednesday at 8 o'clock in the morning and you're 18 and you're struggling with mapping XY coordinates, does that mean that a STEM path for you is out of the question, or is a STEM path in the question? And what are the implications for your choices later on? So I do think that there are so many examples going on of the kind of the ladder supports and the encouragement and the structure, and yet, of course, as Barbara has signaled and others, we see these profound gaps that we're trying to resolve. Going back to the point on evidence, these need to be tested, right? These are the exact kinds of things that are just so wonderful to add experimentation to chronicle, to tell the stories around them, and to figure out ways in which we can identify and describe the context within which these kinds of transitions are happening.
Yes? Go ahead.
I'd like to go back to something that Bo said and something that John said yesterday. First, there's this issue like, is it too late? And I think that the learning science work has shown that the brain really goes through huge development at age 17. So for those of you who think your teenagers are over, it's not over. They're growing and their brains are working and they're getting better. So let's take advantage of this new spurt. But the point that none of us have really talked about that I thought that John raised yesterday, which really kind of I'd like to bring into this conversation about mindsets. And what does that mean? And I'm so concerned that so often in secondary school especially, that the work that the kids are learning means totally irrelevant to their lives. And that's one of the reasons that it makes it so hard to get them interested. And if we're not purposeful about asking relevant questions to teenagers, we're not going to get them interested. And something ticked for those kids to be sitting there in 100-degree weather working on solving a linear equation when they've probably been given that exercise 17 times by the time they've come there. So what can we do to make education more meaningful? And I think you were talking about some of the things, and I think that that's a kind of standard we have to think much more about. Because if we don't get that click in somebody's head right away, we're going to lose them. And so we've got them now at 17, so let's see what we can do with them.
That's a great transition into what I think will be the last question I'll ask, and then we'll go to audience questions. And that's thinking about, where does that spark come from, and potentially the role of role models. We've been talking so far about access to education. Access seems like something that a student or a potential student either has access or they don't have access. What if we flip the frame a little bit and think about inclusion as something that institutions and educators either support and promote or don't in some cases? So inclusion versus exclusion as opposed to access versus not having access. There's evidence from K-12 that having culturally relevant instruction makes a difference for students' learning. There's evidence from K-12 and in higher ed that having an instructor who shares the same race, ethnicity, or gender as the student has positive impacts on that student's performance and persistence. So as we're talking about strategies for expanding access, especially in the US context, with a legacy of historical and institutionalized discrimination and exclusion, can we rely upon sort of generic access policies that are intended to benefit everyone? Will those policies be enough to shrink racial disparities in achievement and attainment?
I think that's a great question. So I mean, I think this is something that universities, presidents grapple with. And I know, for example, a big, as we expand access, we see this, and probably very profoundly on campuses that are more selective. Oftentimes, children who go there or the kids who get in there are maybe the first member of their family to ever go to college. And the issues that they face are very, very different from that of their peers. And that leads to a whole host of feelings of not belonging, social isolation, and these are all deleterious to their mental well-being, and also I think in the long run potentially deleterious to their outcomes later on. So I know one thing that a lot of universities are trying to do, I know Northwestern is doing some of this as well, is try to figure out exactly what services are required to help these students succeed. My sense is these are quite successful, at least in terms of self-reported measures, in terms of just making sure other students of color, first-generation students, are provided with a network of basically similar students demographically who can talk about their issues. A lot of times the issues they're dealing with are just very different. They may have to deal with the fact that other students are all members of sororities or fraternities, and you have to pay fees for that. So there are like financial barriers that lead to some exclusion there, that are issues that the more affluent classmates just don't have to deal with. So there's a whole host of things that I think it's hard even as researchers or faculty to even anticipate barriers that these students face. And I think a lot of work is being done to try and help these students when they come in find a community of similar people facing similar issues, and just even having a connection to other people who've gone through that process before can be profoundly beneficial. Just knowing that there's a student who was there 4 years before, who came from a similar neighborhood, who faced similar challenges, actually made it through, can be very, very helpful to the well-being of these students. And I think we really can't talk about access, as you're exactly right, without making sure that when we mean access, that we basically have made these systems sort of ergonomic, that they're actually designed to accommodate students from various backgrounds. So it's all well and good to say, here's a seat, you have some money, but then once they get there, all these other barriers exist that would not necessarily be perceived as barriers for the typical student, but maybe quite large barriers for the atypical student. And I think universities, are getting better at that, but there's certainly some ways to go.
I'd like to start by, there was a very interesting book by a woman by the name of Maya Beasley, who looked at issues of inclusion at Stanford and Berkeley. If any of you ever get a chance to read it, it's very worthwhile, about how two of these very prestigious universities deal with these issues of inclusion very differently. And it really is the situation that if we understand inclusion, the work by Eppenshay, we have so many of these people who've talked about the importance of how we build inclusion in higher education. I would like to say there's one part of the story that we don't want to talk about, because the issues of affirmative action, the very first cases were about the common good. We do these things for the common good, and I think sometimes that it is the case that we don't recognize the importance that this is for all of us to be able to do. So no, I don't think that the issues of access and the issues of inclusion are solved. I don't think they're solved at all. I think that our structures are basically still making it very difficult for people to get into different places. It goes back to the very beginning of our conversation. Just look at the numbers of low-income and minority kids that are going to two-year institutions and not four-year institutions, and how that varies by money. We have got to make a change, and we have to make sure that the students that are in four-year institutions graduate in a timely fashion. The people that go to two-year institutions don't spend 8 years trying to get an associate's degree. And I think that it's time for us to really realize it's in all of our good, it's in the common good to make this happen.
Great. I think that's a great point to pause our panel here and take some questions from the audience.
Hi, I'm Christy Johns. I'm a visiting scholar here at Kellogg. I am curious of the role of social capital in what you've been speaking. I think it's kind of this overarching or interweaving thread, meaning the resources that are embedded in one's personal networks and how that can help them navigate the education process. On a personal level, it is the relationships and connections that I've been provided that have dramatically changed the trajectory of my life and have made it even possible for me to be in this room talking to you. So I would love to know where you see social capital playing within the different areas where you are researching and working, and how network technologies can help to facilitate and make that accessible to more.
Well, I'll just say one thing about the college application process, which is sort of an indirect evidence that these networks and this sort of capital matters, are just the number of studies that we have showing that students can be thrown off the path to college by seemingly small hurdles like filing the financial aid application. And there are some who would hypothesize and argue, well, how can filling out this form possibly be a determining factor in your decision to go to college or not, which is a huge lifelong investment? How could something like a form make that big of a difference? Social capital networks, information is part of the potential explanation, but whatever the explanation, there's evidence that when students get assistance, or potential students get assistance filling out these forms and submitting these forms, that it does induce them to enroll in college. There's a randomized control study, a very influential study of families who had visited H&R Block to fill out their taxes, and they were randomized into groups that got either nothing or informational assistance or assistance in filling out this form. And the students and families that got the assistance in submitting the FAFSA were 8 percentage points more likely to enroll in college, and subsequently completed an average of 2 years and had higher educational attainment as a result. It wasn't just getting them in the door, so it really made a difference. And to get 8 percentage points, and it was sort of a technological intervention in the sense that it was utilizing, this technology that already had all their information and just sort of automating the process for them. So that's certainly, and there are other studies of similar, helping students surmount these seemingly small hurdles that seems to suggest, if you have networks, a lot of, well-to-do families, the technology is the hyper-involved parent. That is the technology. But there can be other ways to provide help and assistance to students to getting over those barriers, even if they don't come from a family that's got that college knowledge, as they say. Others want to?
I'll sort of just touch on that point without necessarily answering your good question. So I think social capital is really important, and I think it's underlying a lot of these topics is that issue. So, for example, I think the intervention I described in Texas, where teachers were basically encouraged to get kids into the classroom, get the kids who basically would otherwise not have been enrolled in these AP courses into the room. Part of what that is doing, I think, is kind of trying to accommodate for differences in access to social capital that they may have had. So more affluent families naturally are just kind of essentially forcing their kids or strongly encouraging their children to engage in these kinds of practices. What some of these interventions are trying to do is essentially trying to compensate for some of those differences in social capital. I've seen research sort of consistent with what you're saying as well, that basically children who go to college or students who go to college with a higher number of students from their same high school end up actually performing better. I think one clear explanation for that is once you get to college, there are more students that they're similar to you, and you have access. That it may just be social support. It could also just be better information. So I think that all that is very, very important. So I think if we could find a way to sort of harness that or leverage that, I think that would be tremendously valuable. And I think that's a great sort of promise of potential technology in the future.
I think that when I was tying into your question, which I thought was really very interesting, was more about these personalized social networks that people have and the study of these social networks, which has really taken off in amazing kinds of ways. And people are really trying to understand how these social relationships really make a difference in terms of your aspirations, who you depend on for getting work. And the models that are coming out now are really very sophisticated. They deal with selection and influence at the same time. And if you look at the new work that is being done on social networks, it really starts to explain some of these kinds of ways that people share certain values and how they share them over time, what kinds of forces disrupt your networks. I think that if you look to the future, this is something that we're going to see a lot more of because people understand that these networks, whether, Grandin Vetter says it's weak ties or strong ties, that it is really something that is going to become very important, especially because our society is so diffuse and it's so hard to kind of identify close people, especially as young people mature and they move out on their own. And so the network idea is one that you're experiencing, and I think that this is an area of research that's really growing quite fast.
So thank you for your remarks. I want to follow up on a comment that Dr. Schneider had about the common good. And I wanted to ask this to the last speaker, but I'm curious, what's the point of education? Right, so we're talking about access, we're talking about modularizing these things, and yes, people who have more live longer, accumulate more, et cetera, but fundamentally I'm curious if each of you could say a little bit about what's the point? Because I think what's missing in a lot of these conversations is so what?
Yeah. That's a great question, and I'm afraid I can tell you already I don't know that I will have a complete answer to that, but let me just say in the higher education context right now, there's so much movement to measure the outcomes of college, as there is at the K-12 level as well, but college being the thing that many people do right before entering the labor market, there's this big push to measure labor market outcomes of college. And certainly, if you ask students what they think they're going to college for, employment opportunities is absolutely an important, and I think a totally fine, that we should acknowledge that is an important role of education to be able to be productive and self-sufficient on the other side of things. But there's also the fact that we can measure labor market outcomes a lot more easily than we can measure all of the other things that we're hoping students will get out of a college education or of their education more broadly. And so what tends to happen is sort of this, what's the point? The point is a very long list of things, including health and well-being and social connectedness and civic engagement. And sometimes those things can be measured. In many cases, they can't, or they aren't measured very well. And so what you get is a focus on the things we can measure, and then maybe a sentence of caveat, of course, we care about all this other stuff too. I hope that going forward, I am optimistic going forward, new ways of collecting data, new uses of administrative data will enable us to look at a much wider range of outcomes besides just earnings. But it is a challenge, and I think we always need to, especially as the two economists here on the panel, need to be, a little bit, have some humility about the things that we can provide evidence on at a point in time and the things that we struggle to provide evidence on at a point in time. And just because we don't have the evidence on a certain question doesn't mean that those other factors are not important. I'll stop there.
I just want to, I really do like the question, and it's a profound question. I would only make a very brief point, which is for any of us who see in whatever education system we participate in, the engagement of students working and collaborating and learning and having the sense of adventure is sort of the payback for all of the things that I see that are the profound challenges within our systems. Pick the example that you like. I mean, one that I could share is visiting in the Central Valley in California in a small school where a soda cap, a Frisbee, and a teacup are put on the table, and the students have the class period to come up with identifying the relationship between the circumference of the circle and the diameter using only a piece of string and a ruler. I mean, to watch 10-year-olds sort of wrestle with the string and the Frisbee and the soda cap and come out of a 50-minute class period with something that really is a profound kind of example of learning and working together and using it to explore things next. And so we have massive gaps in our system, and we have tremendous equity consequences. Those are absolutely right. And at the same time, we've built these social foundations upon which all of us participate, and they're not perfect. They're far from it. And yet, to see a student engaged in their learning with their peers and a really, really wonderful dyadic relationship between a teacher and a learner is a precious moment. So that's one of the reasons.
So I just say, yeah, also a great question. Well, I think the broad question of why this all matters, I mean, I think, well, there's one response which I think is above my pay grade. But then I think in another sort of more narrow focus is sort of why do we go to school? What is the point of that? And the way I come down on this is sort of related to what Judy said, is essentially that I think that the reason that we go to school, the reason we fund public education, is that we want to create productive adults who basically can live meaningful lives. And I think there are various ways in which that can be defined. Obviously, earnings and labor market participation is one of them. But there's a whole host of ways in which that can be done. So like one of the things, so one topic that I tend to write about a lot is the fact that, in the K through 12 system, a lot of evaluations tend to focus pretty narrowly on test scores as the good sort of. And if you do that, then by implication, you're basically saying the reason you go to school is to have higher test scores. I spent a lot of my time pushing back on that. So some recent work I just did basically was looking at elite schools in Barbados. And what I find there is that getting into one of these elite schools has no impact on test scores in the short run. But if we basically administered surveys and collected additional data, and the kids who got into these schools, they actually had access to better social networks, which is one thing there. They were more likely to continue their studies, and they were more likely to go on to get tertiary education. The women were less likely to basically be pregnant as teenagers. They earned more money, and they were just healthier in general. So that would be one of those cases where I think we do have to be very mindful about how we think about what we measure. There's a tendency to sort of look at where the data are as a measure of the good, but I think it's always important to step back and say, well, is this a good measure? Is it a good enough measure? Are we missing something? And I don't know if we'll ever know exactly what that is, but it's a great question. I think it's food for thought.